everyone, and welcome to Life of Design Team Coaching. Today, we're going to talk about honoring their memory. So, for those of you who have lost loved ones, we're going to talk about ways as coaches that we can support you in honoring their memory. All of us kind of go through grieving differently, and there's some cultural expectations depending where you are in the world or what faith practice you may have. So we're going to tackle all of that today. But first, of course, we're going to go to my PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. And I'm going to go to present mode. Let's see if it wants to present. Maybe not. Let's try again. Aha, present mode. When I started getting ready for this morning, the PowerPoint wouldn't come up at all. So I thought I might have to rebuild it from scratch. But I restarted the magic computer and then suddenly it was available again. So here we are. I chose this image of an old gravestone just to demonstrate that, cultures throughout all the years have marked when someone has passed, but done it differently. I noticed on this, there's two kinds of crosses, and there's a dragon, and it looks like a rooster. And so, how we have marked the passing of a loved one has changed over time. That we mark the passing hasn't changed so much, so we still do that. So, here's something funny from Laurel and Hardy member Stan Laurel. If any of you cry at my funeral, I'll never speak to you again. A comedian. I'm trying to be a little bit lighthearted. Okay, so here's a couple of jumping off points for our discussion. Some people have a funeral, some people do not. Some people have a memorial service, and that can happen in the same general location and time frame as the funeral, or sometimes it's later for different reasons, different parts of the country or inclement weather, whatever the reasons may be, to have it later. Some people have a wake. Some people have a prayer service. Some people plant a tree. Some people have a fire ceremony. So, there are different ways to mark the passing of a loved one, and we'll kick that off. Before we do, let's look at some memes. On the left here, it says, I was told there would be a hand basket, as in going to hell in a hand basket. Where's the hand basket? In the middle here, at my funeral, I want to have an omelet bar with signs that say good morning, so I can get one final laugh from beyond the grave. You have to know that's someone who likes those dad jokes. He's got his final dad joke there. And then on the right, if they don't have liquor at my funeral, I'm not going. So recently someone on our team, her father passed away, and she comes from Louisiana region. And they have very party-like wakes. And they celebrate with jazz music, and they dance, and they review all the happy memories. And so it's treated more like a homegoing than it is as a, difficult passing of the person. They try to focus on all of the life that person had, even though the person's no longer with us. So yeah, some people want to lift a glass for someone, and others, more indifferently. So would one of you like to go first just to talk about how we navigate grief and how we handle loved ones that are lost? Would you like to go first, Dean?
Well, we can just talk about what we were talking about before we started recording a little bit. And, we're recording this, 2 weeks after Charlie Kirk's death.
Yes,
And obviously that's been a huge international event.
yes.
But yesterday, you were bringing up to me a tweet that I wrote because there was someone posted yesterday on Twitter a video of Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica, being interviewed on a podcast, and looking like she was holding herself together well enough, right?
Mhm.
And somebody retweeted it and said, I hope if I get killed, my wife is takes more than a week before she shows up in public laughing um and running a business or something like that. It was along those lines.
Mhm.
And that tweet got a lot of attention because it's so insulting and wrong-headed. And yeah, I think in terms of grief, I'm not sure how widespread that is, but I do suspect that many people who are going through serious grief, number one, ha have a lot of shoulds about it, and they probably do have a lot of concerns about if they're doing it right, if it's taking too long, um,
Mhm.
if they're too debilitated, and I think probably most people just need to give themselves permission to experience what they experience, right? And I think too that for mo the most part, people tend to assume that grief will be a linear project process, like that they'll be really sad at the beginning, and as time goes on, they'll be less sad, and then they'll be over it.
Mhm.
It's almost like they kind of think it should follow the same process as, stubbing your toe, right? Like it hurts really bad in the moment, and then you can kind of feel the pain dissipating, and then you forget that you've done it. But it's not really how that works, because especially when the loss is one that is ongoing and that was like really an intimate part of your life. So that so that every time that person's absence reasserts itself in any various part of your life, you feel that absence again.
Mhm.
And so I was saying to you beforehand that those kinds of posts, and you see them all over Twitter, are written by anonymous users, probably men, who are real Reddit brained in some ways. It was just maybe um, so far kind of in their head that they can't identify with any kind of somatic process at all. And they can't understand that sometimes uh, when you're grieving, your body just gets too tired to continue being sad.
Mhm.
And it will naturally kind of bring you to a more stable place to prepare you for the next, uh, you know, period of sadness.
Mhm.
And and people who like those who wrote that like the guy who wrote that tweet, they have in their mind a process by which they think, well, um, here's how people ought to grieve. And then they see someone, especially a woman, who is not following that process, and they get mad about it and they write a tweet. And you see too, it's interesting. The other thing you see in that tweet is the way that this anonymous poster sort of projects his own insecurity out onto a grieving person.
Mhm.
Because what he's saying is, well, if I were married, I would hope my wife would love me enough to keep being sad. Right? He's saying if I were murdered, I would hope my wife would take my death more seriously than Erica is taking Charlie's.
Mhm.
And and that just reflects like a deep-seated anxiety about whether he's actually the kind of person that someone would love and who would make an impact on someone else's life and all of that. And so by projecting that outward, he actually does damage to people who are really grieving. And I would suspect deep down that guy has that attitude because there's just losses from his earlier life that he has not grieved at all. And so by criticizing her grief in a way, he fortifies himself against experiencing his own. So that's what we're talking about. I can say more, but maybe you want to say something. I don't know.
Oh, no worries. I know that there's a famous psychologist who wrote the book, Kubler-Ross, I guess was her last name.
Yeah,
And she talked about the stages of grief
yeah.
as sort of a common barometer for people going through grief, that it's not a single thing, that you could give yourself phases of it or stages of it. I also think that, to have a murder out of the blue, someone who dies to a drunk driver. Mary Catherine Ham is
Mhm.
a pundit, I guess, and she's sometimes on news programs, and she's written columns in different places. And she very famously had a 2-year-old and was 8 months pregnant. And her husband, maybe this is 6 or 7 years ago, was running the Boston Marathon and randomly was run over by a car. So he just didn't come home from the Boston Marathon. And she didn't anticipate that he would not be there when their child was born, their second child, or that he would not come home from the Boston Marathon. And she was a public person. And so she's very pregnant with a little one at his funeral. And then celebrated the child coming in to the world and decided she would have a birthday party for her husband when his birthday actually was, though he was no longer with them, to just kind of knit everything back together, to remember him, to honor that he was a father to these children, and to realize that life goes on. But yeah, when you think about, okay, I still have to go home and eat after the funeral service, but some people are taking it better than others. And even if you have someone who's older and you're anticipating their death in the next little while, whatever that might be, they're in hospice care, it's still startling when they're gone. It's like, oh,
Oh,
I can't call them now. I can't visit them now. I can't send them a card and know that they'll get it and be reminded that I'm thinking of them. So it's still a kind of shock to the system, however your system processes it, even if it's expected or unexpected. Do you have some thoughts, Jonathan? I know you've gone through the death of your father, and I think you come from a culture, having been born on the Day of the Dead, who
Now,
understands that death is a part of life.
yes, so I do have some deep thoughts. They're not serious, but they are deep
Mhm.
because since I was 5, like since I used to look at my kindergarten teacher and think, oh, she's cute, I used to have the same thoughts when it came to like death. Like, why is it that every time? Because fortunately or unfortunately, I have been in too many funerals. Like some kind of like relative that I didn't even knew, but I was like, you're a kid, so they take you there.
Mhm.
So for good or for bad, I have been to many, many funerals, and most of them they were very sad, to be honest. Like they were not like joyful celebrations or anything like that. They were very, very sad. I never liked them. I I never liked them. I
Mhm.
had to go because I had to go.
Mhm.
But I always wonder. I think there's something missing here. This can be better. Um. So by the time I experience the death, for example, the death of my own father, of course, when it happened, I was not like this. I did cry. I was not crying for like days, but when it did happen, because I was right there with him, there were tears, and I couldn't. How can you not, right?
Yeah, your heart is feeling
So
it. Yeah.
I do believe that there is a time and there's a moment in, in space where you can allow to feel anything you want to feel or anything that comes to you. It's totally fine. For some people might take longer than a couple hours. For some people might take a couple days. um, to allow yourself to get all the emotions, because it's like a waterfall of emotions that comes to you and through you.
Mhm.
So I do believe that feeling every single one of them is valid. Um,
Mhm.
Now, once you went through the motion of all these emotions, I do not think that it's a good idea to get stuck into one of those emotions because most of them are going to be negative,
Mhm.
especially because of the way death has been presented upon us.
Yes.
That's another topic. Uh,
Mhm.
in my experience, I do not see death as something bad. I
Mhm.
see that as something beautiful. And
Mhm.
I always say, for someone that doesn't agree with that,
Mhm.
just imagine that you were born in some laboratory and you're like a monkey that they do experiments on.
Mhm.
And and then imagine if you live forever, you're going to be stuck there with these scientists for the rest of eternity. So that's kind of, it doesn't sound pleasant at all. So that, for if you get out of your own human perspective, it actually is not a bad thing. It's just a transition of energy. So yeah, feeling the emotions, because some of the humans that are going to pass away are going to be closer to us. Obviously, if somebody that is close to you passes away, the impact is greater than somebody like the cousin of your nephew's neighbor. That's
Yes.
a totally different experience.
Yes.
There was one more point that I was thinking of, but I can come back with that one. We can do another round, and then I can bring that one back.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've shared some research in our notes in the podcast. You can look below and notice those. One of the things was 19 ways to remember someone you've lost.
Mm.
And it might be a best friend or a classmate or a coworker, or it could be a loved one. But maybe we can talk about different ways that you can honor the memory of someone. And today we have these sympathetic relationships with people online that we get to know. So, and then, I remember in the 60s, girls going crazy because the Beatles were in town. And they would just have these just emotional, oh, crying and hysterical. The Beatles are here. They, of course, don't know the Beatles, but they have created this, sympathetic emotional relationship with someone that's held up. And I think that can happen with movie stars or, political or government figures or someone like Charlie Kirk who'd impacted a lot of people. You can feel grief and you never met them, never knew them, and still you have a little bit of grief to process. And so honoring their memory, some of the 19 ways are in a restaurant for someone you knew to order their favorite food and think of them while you eat it. So, or you can have a memorial even years after the person's gone and just invite other people that also knew that person and share stories about here's something that he used to say, or that here's something she used to do. And it's a way to kind of keep them alive. I wrote down something Seneca said, since Stoicism is having such a moment. Ancient philosopher from Greece, he said, to have may be taken away from us, to have had, never. So while the person may no longer be in our life, they were in our life, whether they were in our life on the screen, or in our life, in our real life. You get to keep those memories, get to have those interactions, get to have shared those feelings. You'll always have that, even if the person is no longer around to continue in a relationship or to still be seen or heard from. So, do you guys have some thoughts about what you might do? I remember at my father's memorial that there was a lot of pressure and tension to memorialize his life in a way that was respectful and that people could relate to. My brother talked about his military service, and I talked about his spiritual teachings. And different people came up and spoke about the impact that he had on their lives. And then we felt we'd done him justice at the memorial. And then close family went and had a drink. And then we got to laugh about the jokes he said or how he would greet you. I could say, "How are you doing, Dad?" And he'd say, "I'm finer than frog hair." He'd say, "I'm atomic." So the kind of things you don't hear today. So
Never heard that one before.
no, I'm atomic. Yes, he worked at Lockheed, so he was involved with the physicists at Lockheed, and so that meant something to him. Being part of the atomic age, I'm atomic. And so every once in a while, when I talk to someone about Dad who knew him, I could say, "Are you atomic today?" And it's a callback to something he used to say. So, Dean, do you have some thoughts about how you might honor the memory of someone, whether you knew them in person or in real life?
I have a few thoughts on some of the different things we said, and I'll get to that one. It's
Mhm.
interesting that you brought up Seneca because that quotation is probably from his essay called "On the Brevity of Life," right? So uh, that's definitely worth a read. It's very interesting how the important things have not changed since Roman time
Mhm.
because one of the things he says is, your life is short. Do you want to spend it arguing with your wife?
Yeah.
Right. The other thing is, in terms of resources, a few years ago, I listened to the audiobook of a wonderful book, which was a book of case studies by an English therapist who specializes in grief. And I can't remember the title, but people who are listening might be interested in that. I'm sure you could ask Chat GPT. What's the name of the memoir or case studies by a therapist who specializes in grief in England that came out in the last 15 years? And it would come up. But I remember thinking that was really a beautiful book. On the other thing, one more thing I wanted to say about just the grief process for people is, I think too that people probably grieve the way they do everything else, in the sense that there's people bring a frame to their losses. And part of the reason that Erica Kirk has gotten some resentment about hers is that her frame is, this is terrible and I have work to do. Right. So she's in a frame where she's able to see that her loss is shared by millions of people and that her husband was killed in the middle of work that he and she thinks is important.
Mhm.
And so that's a very different frame from, somebody who experiences the death of another and who grieves kind of around a narrative of, I've lost everything, I can never recover. This is meaningless. What's the point of life? So I think for grieving people, it might be worth just reflecting on what's the narrative, what's the frame that you're bringing to this experience, and to see if that's really a frame that you want to continue with, or if you might start to ask yourself questions around the way you framed your experience of grief so that you could maybe begin to shift what it means,
Mhm.
right? So I thought that might be important for people. I think the other thing I wanted to say about remembrance, I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of familial warmth. Okay, there's all this research on basically emotional warmth in families. And it seems to me that part of what might create that, especially for children, is kind of a family ritual of remembering your ancestors.
Mhm.
And even if that is just like sitting with your children and looking at old photographs and telling them who's who,
Mhm.
or and some people I know the last few years as we've been going through a certain kind of cultural shift, genealogical work has become a huge thing too. And I think remembering people in that way is probably a way of creating that warmth for children. and especially because it kind of orients them into a historical line. It gives them a narrative for their own lives. It situates them in the world in the way that, you know, without that, you're just sort of this atomized individual floating around with no anchoring in any historical lineage or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I do think that there's a way that, your ancestors can be remembered and your descendants can be strengthened all at the same time by kind of having a family value of remembering.
Mhm.
And that making that kind of remembrance a regular, routine part of family life probably has value that will take years and years to bloom into its fullness.
Yeah, I do think that there are people who grow up and they don't have biological family,
Mhm.
or the generations ahead, their grandparents are already gone, or they don't have cousins or like that. So that doesn't seem like there's connective tissue in history about where they came from or who they are, or they in fact don't know where they came from or, biologically who they are. So I do think that helps people put themselves in place and time. And yes, telling the stories of the grandfather who came over from Ireland, or, whatever that looks like, it helps people see that they're a part of a continuity.
Hmm.
I'm next in line and there's people after me. So I know
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say to Jonathan that there are some appreciation of ancestors. We have Liz in Vietnam who does our video editing. And on their high holy days, there's a lot of work for ancestors. There's a lot of pictures that go up in like restaurant or store windows, and there's flowers and offerings, and people have a job to do to honor ancestors. It's absolutely part of the culture, and not so much in the West, but you had a thought, and then I'd like to turn this over to Jonathan.
I had a thought. I think my thought was just to say that if you have a ritual of remembering in your family, right, that probably at some level it makes it easier to face your own mortality. If you have a belief that, that you are anchored to those who came before you, but also that maybe this ritual of remembering will continue and you are entering into that sort of hall of the remembered in a way that you won't be that you've established a ritual of remembering that maybe you will not be forgotten.
Yeah, I think so. There's a thought process about inviting children to funerals, having people attend memorial services, because it lets you kind of put a period at the end of the sentence of the person's life. You get to close the chapter. And so you're engaged in a mutual process of completion of this life that was lived. And for some people, memorial services are a waste of time, or funerals are a waste of time because they don't have a faith component in their lives and they just don't think it's necessary. And so, particularly in our modern day, I think there's less investment in the West anyway, in the ritual of let's put a period at the end of the sentence. Let's all of
Mm-hmm.
us jointly complete our remembrance of this person's life. I know when my grandfather died, I think I was 12, and I was told that he died. And then I remember asking, like 2 months later, well, what's happened to Grandpa? Well, he died. Well, I know, but what happened after that? Like nothing happened after that. They cremated
Mm-hmm.
him. They gave the ashes to grandmother. There was no memorial service. There was no nothing. And I said, well, how come we didn't have a funeral? Well, he didn't want one. Well, I can understand honoring that, but what about the rest of us? Like we didn't get a chance to like finish or say goodbye or remember. And so I think you have to honor the wishes of the person who's passed away, But then there's also some housekeeping for the person that live on, even if it's a separate memorial service that's not religiously oriented or whatever, raise a glass, something to kind of have a finishing moment. Do you have some more thoughts, Jonathan?
Yes, I do. Actually, it's part of what I was thinking earlier. It's the honoring part, which
Mhm,
I do think is actually important.
mhm,
However, I have experience. This is just me talking out of personal experience,
mhm,
but I do think it's important to mention it because, in my experience, whenever somebody that, like, let's say, family member died, it automatically became like the greatest person on planet Earth. It was like Jesus and then that person. So I always, all again, I cannot help myself to be wondering, being like, I don't know about that. Like I like they were pretty good to me, but like they had their nasty side too, as a
mhm,
human being.
mhm,
So I do believe that honoring them it's extremely important because we are here because of our ancestors. If it wasn't because of them, we wouldn't be here. So I do agree that honoring them it's important. I
mhm.
also must add that not making them an automatic saint is also important.
Not
And I can
elevating
talk
them
from
to sainthood upon their death. Yeah. Mhm,
yes, and I can talk for experience. Like my own father, for example, he
mhm,
had many great, amazing traits, skills that he taught me, but he also had many things that I will never
mhm,
would like to pass upon the next generation.
mhm,
So
mhm,
I am like we become like a link between the next generation and the older generation. So
mhm,
I do believe that it's actually our responsibility to not automatically make someone like a saint
mhm.
and honor the good things about them. Like
Yes.
this trait was amazing.
Mhm,
No, I've never met anybody like this when it came to this. That's valid,
mhm,
beautiful. But also, hey, what about this and this? And what about this other trait? I wouldn't if I had like a kid, that would be the next like the update version. There's no need for the other stuff. So
mhm,
keeping that in check, I do believe it's important, and it because it's otherwise it messes with our experience because then
mhm,
we lose track of like actual reality as it is.
mhm.
But yes, when it comes to honoring, I am pro honoring of ancestors, and one of the ways that I like to do it is like I said, choose the one of the best like traits, skills, mindsets that they had, applying them on regular basis, and also um, make like like for example, sometimes I don't feel like doing exercise. Like sometimes I just feel like being a couch potato and just watch something on Netflix or watch like a conspiracy theorist show. Like, but then I remember what is something that my father, some of the good traits, he will be like, "Hey, what are you doing in the couch? Go to the gym, go do some exercise. Like, don't just be laying down. Like, there's no time for that stuff." So then I remember, and I'm like, the way I honor him is like, okay, fine. I don't want to go. That is the last thing I want to do. This is the last place on earth that I want to be right now. And then next thing you know, I am doing some kind of like physical movement. So yeah, it is important to honor them, but it's also important to keep in check the things that because they were human, so they have flaws.
Mhm,
So keep in check those parts.
mhm. Yeah, I think being honest about who they were still lets you honor them and love them and they live on in us the way you described. So, and I think they would appreciate that they have a living legacy in you, you know. Okay, do we have any final thoughts? I know it's a difficult subject for the Western world, though in some parts of the world Death is just as vital as life. It's just a part of it. And for other people, it's a little bit taboo as a subject. But I think it's helpful, especially this public death that many of us in the Western world recently we had some feelings about. It's useful to step up and manage any grief process you have, or talk to somebody who's maybe been through some grief and ask how they did it, and navigate it for yourself. So, Dean, final thoughts on how do people get a hold of you?
My only final thought is just like with everything else, loss is something that you handle better if you are proactive about it.
Mhm.
And I think the default state is to let these things happen to you without actively thinking about, how can I handle this? What can I do to make this meaningful? What can I do to make this maybe easier? And to own your experience in a way that allows you to exercise what control you do have, I think is probably important for people to remember. People can find me at deanabbott.com, at Twitter / Dean Abbott, and at alifedesign.org.
We'll put all those links in the description. I
Very
do
good.
think that sometimes death reminds people about the life they're living.
Yeah.
Sometimes it creates a chance to check in. I've been wanting to do this thing and afraid to do it. Maybe I should stop being afraid. Or I've, been down a path and I don't think that's how I want my life to go. I'm going to rethink, what I'm doing with my life or my time. Or I'm really happy with how my life is going. And, I'm taking with me the gifts that this person may have given me to have a rich and rewarding life. So sometimes it's just a moment of reflection about how is my life going? Since it's not up to us necessarily the date and time of our death. So, any final thoughts, Jonathan, and how do people get a hold of you?
Yes. Also, just for the record, because I don't think I mentioned anything about. I know I saw that it did happen. This unfortunate event to this guy, Charlie Kirk. Never
Mm-hmm,
met him.
mm-hmm,
I know for because of videos what he was into. I think is extremely fucked up. That is something that I do not think is a shouldn't shouldn't happen to anybody just because of their own beliefs. So whoever did that, I think they should be publicly executed. Uh, just so like it doesn't happen again. I do believe that people can disagree or agree, but talking about that, I think it's a good idea. Keep that in mind. Um, and yeah, also it's a good thing I remembered, and because like something like this happened, and then humans may think, oh, it was like it happened all of a sudden. And I think a good way to prepare yourself for situations like that, because anything can happen. Like my heart can throw a tantrum and I can die right now. Like anything can. We are so fragile. I think it's a humble experience to remember ourselves that we are mortals, and now that is like all of a sudden it's just that we forget that it's always there. We don't see it, but it's always there. It's happening everywhere around us. Some plants are dying and others are growing. Some birds are dying and others are growing. So preparing yourself psychologically to understand that if you have a kid, uh, not that I'm wishing that for the kid, but like I have nephews and nieces, but at any time it can happen because we are mortals. And I think that is something that the West does, is like something that we like to like avoid to have that conversation. It's like mm, nobody, that doesn't happen here. So I think a good way to prepare yourself for any kind of like in the future for those situations is coming to terms with your own mortality, and that helps a lot. and and yes, you can find me on alivedesign.org. Also on Jonathan R Coaching on Instagram as well, and jonathanrcoaching@gmail.com.
Oh, excellent. Good. Well, and I'll have those links in the description. So thank you for joining us today for this conversation. I think it can be helpful when there's kind of this public death is to treat it as a practice run for how you're going to manage grief when someone you personally know may die. Think about, what would I want if I died? What would I want to communicate to my family? How can I, if we haven't had the conversation with children, maybe this is a reminder to have that conversation. What happens when we die? How do we take care of things? So it's a natural part of life, and this might just create opportunity to explore it for ourselves. So thanks for this thoughtful conversation, and we'll see you all next time.